Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Amsterdam Talk Season 4, Episode 26. I'm your host, Rod, and today I'm with Jonathan Farley. How you doing today?
I'm all right under the circumstances. Thank you.
I understand. Under the circumstances, we found your story. Oh, I got two things planned. My fault. I have two
Okay.
things planned. I'm wondering why I'm hearing the backdrop. All right, so tell us what you said under the circumstances. So we found your story on podcast. Guess what you explained about, your 84-year-old mother was kidnapped illegally by by his brother or your brother,
By my brother, yeah. Two
by
of
your
them.
brother who
Yeah.
directed the police who brutally dragged her out of her house. At one point, she screamed, "You're breaking my arm."
She screamed it several times. Yes.
Okay, so how did this all occur? Like, how did your brother guess come up with this or do this?
Well, that's what I'd like an investigation to uncover. This was a crime, and there's been no investigation. But what happened was, back in on or after January 19, 2023, my brother Christopher John Farley, who lives in the New York City area, New Rochelle,
Mhm.
tried to put a woman in my mother's house named Mary Ho, H-O. My brother Chris claimed that this woman was going to be a home health care aide, but
Mhm.
one, my mother didn't need a home health care aide. Two, she didn't
Mhm.
want one. In fact, a couple days after this, um, a friend of my mother's from her church tried to visit my
Hmm.
mother, and Mary Ho, the alleged home health care aide, wouldn't even let my mother's friend talk to my mother,
Mm.
saying she's not on the list. And I'm thinking, what list? You mean my brother Chris has created a list and only those people are allowed to talk to my mother? This is crazy in her own
Mm.
house.
Right.
But it came to a head when my mother told Mary Ho to leave or
Hmm.
to not come back, that this wasn't working out. And then we went to the sheriff's office to just tell them that we had done this. They made a police report, and then 2 days later, police come to our house with
Hmm.
Mary Ho and two of my brothers, Christopher and Anthony Farley, and they take my mother. Now,
Mm.
at the time, I didn't know what they were there for. I thought they were there because they were going to force us to keep Mary Ho in our house. In New York State, they have these kinds of laws where even if someone's a squatter, you can't just summarily kick them out, or at least so I thought.
Right.
But my mother had every right to tell Mary Ho to leave. She'd only been there like 8 or 9 days.
Right.
Um, but so you can see the police video of this on the web page, Ena Farley, jan31.com for January 31. But I thought that this was just, even though at some point I'm yelling, "Does my mother have to go with you?" I actually didn't know that they were there to take my mother. My mother is shouting, I need to talk to my lawyer." Well,
Right.
when my mother didn't return, I realized they had kidnapped her. I waited 2 more days before trying to file a missing persons report. They wouldn't let me file a missing persons report. The police just wouldn't let me do it, which is, I think, unheard of. And they wouldn't tell me why they weren't telling me where my mother was.
Hmm.
So imagine this: it's supposed to be the United States, and is the fugitive slave law in effect still? They take someone, and I can't even be told where she is. Is this the Gulag in the Soviet Union?
Hmm.
But they also wouldn't tell me why they weren't telling me. But I happened to know that on February 5 days after the kidnapping, my mother was supposed to meet up with a friend of hers named Martha Klasquin.
Okay.
And that was supposed to be at a church, not our church, but another church in the village where we live, for a concert. And so I happened to guess that my mother would be there. Now, my mother did have a memory problem. She typically couldn't remember what happened the day before,
Hmm.
or sometimes at night she might forget what happened in the morning. But she could have conversations, she could make decisions. She, we had conversations all the time about complex topics. Like we would watch the news, we would talk about current events. We could talk about my personal life. But she was not mentally incompetent. No one had said she was mentally. No doctor had said she was mentally incompetent. No judge had said she was mentally incompetent. None of that. Well, I saw my mother in the church with Mary Ho and with Martha Clasquin. I told my mother that Mary Ho had helped kidnap her 5 days before. My mother immediately said, "Let's go." So my mother asked Mary Ho to move aside. Mary Ho refused to budge. In fact, Mary Ho called 911. If you can imagine that. She's one of the kidnappers calling police on me, her son, the son of Ena Farley. But my mother just barreled past Mary Ho. And I suggested to my mother, okay, we could either drive around or go back home. My mother said, let's go back home. And so we go back home, and about 15 minutes later, the police come to our house. And they stay there for about 2 hours. And my mother's telling them, hey, look, I'm happy to be here. I don't know who those other people were who had me. I want to be with my son, Jonathan, and under his care and guidance. I'm even hanging back, and my mother's talking to the police. And this goes on for about 2 hours. At one point, the police even are overheard on their police body camera footage saying there's no urgency.
Right.
So the police at this point should have left. They were breaking the law, even being on the property, after the sole homeowner, my mother, tells them, leave. I'm fine here. There's no emergency, as the police themselves indicate. My mother's not a danger to herself or to others. And none of those reasons that police might be able to use to stick around. They're breaking violating her constitutional rights, even just staying there. But they do stay there. And then after about an hour, according to the police body camera footage, they reach this new plan. They're determined to take my mother. And they claim that there are some pills that she has to take that are not in the house. Now, what are these pills? My mother doesn't even understand what they're talking about. She says, what are these pills? If you're telling me I have to take some pills, I have to run them by a doctor, doctor. I have to ask my sister who worked in the pharmaceutical industry to recommend some colleagues who can tell me about them. But eventually, the police admit that, no, it's just the same old pills you've been taking for blood pressure, high blood pressure. Okay. And so I tell the police, all these pills are in the house, which they were. In fact, if you look at the January 31st footage, you can see a tray of pills on our kitchen table. But this was now February 5, and you can see this footage on the webpage EnaFarleyTaken.com and also EnaFarleyFeb5.com from a different perspective. And eventually they say, oh, it's 5 o'clock. You've got to take these pills at 5 o'clock. They wait another half hour, and then they just use force on her. So they drag her out. She's screaming, you're breaking my arm. They tie up her hands and feet like a fugitive slave. They tie her down to a gurney. And she's saying, leave me in my house. These are now criminals. They are criminals wearing badges, and they're also ambulance workers. But these are criminals who need to be right now arrested. All of them. And they're all visible in the police body camera footage that I have. Okay. And then they tie her up. In New York State, you're not even allowed to physically restrain residents of nursing homes, but they tied her up, took her away. And for the next year, I only saw her for 40 minutes over the course of the next year, again, with no justification. So this was a straight up kidnapping. Now, a lot of people might find it hard to believe because there's been no action over this. And my mother died last month. There's been no action. Sorry to hit it. She died a slave, in other words. But there's been no action, and I'm trying to figure out why. And I think it's because people hear the story and think there must be more to it, and then they don't ask the second question. Okay, if there is more to it, what more? But the answer is there isn't. It was just a straight up kidnapping orchestrated by my brother Chris Farley and my brother Anthony Farley with Mary Ho, who used to date my third brother, Felipe Farley. So the three of them conspired, or four if you include my brother Felipe Farley, conspired to kidnap my mother. They locked her up in a memory care facility called Cranberry Landing in the town of Irondequoit, New York, upstate New York, and drugged her against her will. Now, eventually, my father's cousin, Jane Farley, Dr. Jane Farley, who's also an attorney, managed in her first ever trial, managed to defeat my brother Chris in court and have his, so about 5 weeks after the kidnapping, Chris was named temporary guardian of my mother. But my cousin Jane Farley managed to defeat Chris in court and have his temporary guardianship revoked. But I want to make a point here. The kidnapping occurred when there was no guardianship case at all. There was no court case of any kind.
So there was no guardianship.
There was no guardianship, correct.
So
kidnapping of a free woman.
Right, kidnapping of a free woman. So basically, Mary Ho, right? Mary Ho.
Yes, Mary Ho.
Mary Ho was supposed to be brought in as a caretaker, which she didn't need a caretaker.
Correct.
So your brother decided that she needed a caretaker without consulting all four of you or three of you?
No, he just made the decision on his own, but he was obviously working with Anthony Farley and Felipe Farley, who used to date Mary Ho.
Okay. So Mary Ho moved in for 9 days, no squatters' rights, really.
Correct. None at all. Yes, right. Yeah, no rights at all. You can, in New York State, it turns out up to 14 days, you can just summarily kick somebody out. No questions that are supposed to be asked. But instead, my mother was the one who was removed, and she never again saw her house, well, except for maybe 3 hours total in her entire life.
So they put her in a mental institution?
They put her in, you could call it that. It was a memory care facility, but she was locked up with no explanation for why she was locked up. She was drugged against her will, which is a crime. At the very least, the director of the Cranberry Landing should be arrested. And the doctors who drugged my mother should lose their licenses, if not be arrested. But in that facility, it was even worse than what I've described. My brother, Chris Farley, created a list. And at one stage, it seemed, I was told there are only about 8 names on it. I subpoenaed a list that had 17 names.
That couldn't contact her, right? That couldn't contact her?
Oh, no. You see, this is it. It's the opposite.
That could contact her.
Only those 17 people out of the 8 billion on Earth, only those 17 people could visit or telephone my mother.
Well, because I'm going off earlier when you said, she had a no contact. They made a no contact list.
No, yeah.
So now they made a no contact list. Now they have a contact list.
No. The only list that we haven't subpoenaed all these documents, but so you need to know there needs to be a criminal investigation. The only list I'm aware of is the contact list, but it's a no contact list for everybody who's not on the list, which is 8 billion people minus 17.
Right.
So only these 17 people were allowed to telephone my mother or visit her with no explanation for why she was being isolated like this. And who was on this list? 3 of the people, I believe, were my brother's lawyers. And then in the guardianship case that began a week after the violent kidnapping, there's a court evaluator. His name was on the list. Why his name is on the list, I have no idea. And my brother Chris and Anthony were on the list, but not my brother Felipe. My mother's younger sister was not on the list, so she could neither telephone nor visit my mother, her own younger sister. There were some people that my mother did know, but then there were some names that even I didn't recognize, and I'm pretty certain my mother didn't know these people, in addition to my brother's lawyers, who my mother obviously didn't know. So, and as far as I know, this list may have been padded.
What about you?
I was not on the list with no explanation. My brother Felipe was not on the list with no explanation. My mother's younger sister was not on the list with no explanation. When my father's cousin, Jane Farley, tried to visit my mother, they threatened to call police on her. No explanation. And this violates, in fact, the New York State Department of Health's own list of rights of residents of nursing homes, which says that a resident is allowed to see whomever she pleases. And the facility is not allowed to bar anyone, and no, they're not allowed to allow any agent to bar anyone from visiting the resident of the nursing home. So it's a complete violation of their own list. Now, I don't know if that list of rights for the New York State Department of Health is a law, but it's on the New York State Department of Health's website. I filed 2 complaints with the New York State Department of Health, asking them to investigate. They never got back to me, but this would have been the starting place. I told them this woman is being held against her will. It should have been a 5-minute investigation, maybe 1 day. I'll give them some leeway. That should have been a 1-day investigation. They should have called up, found out that there's this list which violates their own rules, their own list of rights of residents of nursing homes, and that should have been the end of it. So it's obvious, though, why Chris Farley made this list. He made this list because he knew my mother was not mentally incompetent, and he needed to make sure no one could talk to her. Fortunately, there's one person on the list that I was in touch with. This is the woman that Mary Ho had barred from speaking to my mother. And she made about a half dozen videos of my mother while she was held against her will at Cranberry Landing, the memory care facility. And so my mother's having these conversations with her and with someone else. And you can hear that my mother is not mentally incompetent. Now, she never was ruled to be mentally incompetent, at least not for 10 months or so. So it was illegal from day one for them to hold her. But just informally, you can hear that she is not mentally incompetent. She looks as if she has aged years. She's weak and frail. After about 10 months, you can see even a walker in her room. She never needed a walker. I was just speaking with someone today who tells me my mother would walk to the local McDonald's, which is about a mile away, and even not even accept rides back from some people that she knew because she didn't need it. She could walk further than I could tell you. And this is, so she had no physical problems. And if you go to the webpage, Ena Farley, Jan 31, which was the first kidnapping, you can see that she's walking up and down. At one point, my brother, Anthony Farley, they try to get her in a car, and she gets out of the car because she wants to know what's going on with all the police in her house. And Anthony admits he couldn't keep her in the car, right? So she's physically robust on January 31st. 10 months later, she's broken physically. She's broken physically. So any claim that this was for her health is obviously a false claim. Her health deteriorated until her death because of being shoved by Chris Farley with his vicious lawyer, Miles Zatkowski, over the course of the next 18 months. At one stage, we had sufficiently defeated Chris in court to get another lawyer besides my cousin, who said they can't keep her out of her house. She's allowed to go back to her house. She can go back to her house legally. The judge has no right to bar her from going back to her house. But then Felipe Farley at this point had become guardian, and he did not put her back in the house. Felipe Farley, remember, dated one of the kidnappers, Mary Ho. So so my mother was placed until her death in the hands of the people who kidnapped her or who dated the people who kidnapped her. And then she died.
So, no, go ahead. I'll listen to you.
Everyone knows your health doesn't, like nursing homes are for people that nobody wants, or people who are so far gone physically and mentally that only professionals can take care of them. My mother was not that. In fact, they made her confused by drugging her. And of course, as I said, she physically fell apart. And at one point, I sent you a photo of this. She was beaten at Cranberry Landing. At least that's what she told her visitor. The person who made the video of my mother said that my mother initially told her that an employee had beaten her. She's got blood in her eye. She's got deep bruises on both sides of her face. And in the video, she complains about pain in her chin. Now, the main place where you can see videos about my mother's ordeal is the YouTube channel Free Ena Farley. You can see it at the bottom of your screen. And in that video, the sound has been altered. And I think it's because Chris Farley contacted YouTube and told them to not allow the sound to be played. But I can't prove that. But it shows you the extent to which he was willing to go to hide his crimes. And he did commit crimes. He committed the crime of kidnapping, for which Chris Farley should be immediately arrested. Anthony Farley, since he played a role, probably committed enough of a crime that we could uncover to be arrested. He certainly should be arrested in my book, but the question is how much proof can we find? But with Chris Farley, there's definitely enough. And of course, the police who did it should be arrested. But that's not what's happening. The sheriff of Monroe County, where we are, has not replied to any of my 10 letters. As I told you, they have not even allowed me to file a criminal report, which is insane to me. Like, how could they not even, like, they can ignore my report, but to not even allow me to submit one? What's going on in Monroe County? The district attorney, I haven't heard from the district attorney's office for about a year and a half.
Here's the photo that you shared earlier right here.
The photo, yes, of my mother with, she has these dark bruises on both sides of her face, blood in her eye. And in the video, which you can find on the YouTube channel Free Ena Farley, but the sound has not been distorted, if you could hear the sound, she's complaining about a pain in her chin. Now, in that video, she also speculates that, okay, did she fall? But yeah, she has memory problems. But of course, this is 10 months after she's been imprisoned in that place illegally, her rights stripped from her illegally. And the main culprit, even though there was no court case going on when she was kidnapped, was a Judge Christopher Chaccio, CIA CCIO, who's the surrogate court judge in Monroe County. He's the one who said it was perfectly okay for her to be locked up and people not allowed to visit her. So whether or not the judge is criminally responsible, I do not know, because he might have some level of immunity. But he certainly is morally culpable for the crime inflicted on my mother, and I regard him morally as another culprit in the crime against my mother. Now, some people might be wondering why they're doing this. I don't know, but that they committed a crime is an undeniable fact. I mean, they would deny it, but it's an undeniable fact. It needs to be investigated. And these, not only that, if people want to know, okay, was there a money motive? I now am absolutely confident that there was. My mother's bank account, about 10 days before she died, was either empty or almost empty. I didn't have access to her bank account, but Chris Farley did.
Well, you can't force me to do that.
We can force.
We found this is the video.
I'm black.
Yes.
It's because you're breaking my arm. You're breaking my arm. I don't want to go. You're breaking my arm. You're breaking my arm. I don't want.
Relax.
I'm not.
Take a breath.
I don't need a hospital.
Take a big. We have to get
My
a
son. No, you don't have to. No, do not. Do not.
You're okay. We're not.
No, I'm not going. I'm barefooted.
I know you are.
You're hurting me.
I'm barely touching
saying you're hurting her.
You're hurting me.
On all the body camera.
It is on all the body camera footage. No,
access to it.
I'm black. That's why.
No,
It's you're hurting me.
I am now witnessing them grab my mother. I have the right to speak under the First Amendment to the Constitution. And they are grabbing my mother by force, and they're pushing her, and she is resisting. I am.
I'm not going. I don't want to go.
For human rights.
No.
She's squealing. And she better get that piece of paper back. All those pieces of paper. They are taking her out by force. Mom,
Don't
I
do
can't
it.
help
We
you.
have
Help
to.
you. So
You don't have a choice, ma'am. Yes. No, I don't want to go. Yes. I don't want to go yet. I don't want to go yet.
Wow, that is everything you said to us and we listened to. Sounds like she was very comfortable, that she understood what was going on. Like, none of that false accusation that you're saying to us that, that they're saying that something was wrong. It doesn't seem wrong to me.
No, nothing was wrong. Although, actually, I want to correct myself. Everybody who watches the video agrees that my mother was of sound mind. But I also want to say that having a memory problem, as I said, she couldn't remember what happened the day before typically. I have no idea if that is cause for physically in violently removing someone from her own home against her will. In fact, I doubt that if that has ever been done in the modern history of New York State, if not the modern history of the entire country. But as it happens, my mother was at a low point of cognition compared to how she was for the previous several years. Only twice before had I seen her more confused. And those were times when she had low blood sugar or when we thought she had low blood sugar. I think, and my mother said, that Mary Ho is drugging her. That Mary Ho, in the 8 or 9 days she was in our house, was drugging my mother with something that made her more confused. I do know for a fact Mary Ho was giving my mother melatonin. I saw it with my own eyes.
Sleep man.
Most people think melatonin is just a sleep aid, but my mother had no issue with sleeping. It wasn't on the list of pills that she was taking. She was taking things like for high blood pressure or for memory, Prevagen, which is over the counter, for diabetes, vitamin C, stuff like that. Not melatonin, but I looked it up, and sleep aids like melatonin increase the risk of dementia and memory loss by 79%. So I have a theory. All it is a theory, is that my brother Chris Farley knew this, and he'd been trying to get my mother to take something to create a condition that did not exist, so he could justify stealing her property and her money.
So that's what it was all about at the end.
But that's speculation on my part, but that's what a real police investigation should have uncovered.
Right.
My mother should have perhaps been taken to a hospital voluntarily to see if Mary Ho had been drugging her. Right. And what they had drugged her with, because she did sound more confused than normal. But 2 weeks before Mary Ho had been put in her house, my mother was not like that. And but even so, as you said, and as everyone who watches the video says, she knows what's going on. But regardless, you can't just take someone from her house. It's not the Soviet Union. It's not Nazi Germany. It's not the antebellum South. You can't just take someone from her own house when she says, I am happy here.
Right.
Christopher Farley had no legal authority to do that. People think, oh, did he have power of attorney? He claims to have had power of attorney. I haven't seen the document verified, but it doesn't even matter. Power of attorney does not make you the slave owner of somebody else. It does not give you their house.
Right.
In fact, an attorney who specializes on tenant and landlord issues told me that it doesn't matter. What matters is whose name is on the deed of the house. And at that time, only my mother and my late father were on the deed. Only their names are on the deed. So Chris had no legal authority to do anything. And yet the police acted as if he was the only one to be listened to. That man grabbing my mother's arm and she's screaming, "You're breaking my arm," that's a Sergeant Mazenga. He needs to be immediately arrested. The woman smiling in the background, I don't know her name. They should not be allowed to conceal her name. She needs to be certainly charged with something, or maybe she can turn state's evidence.
Well, that was my next question. Was going to ask about those cops. You know, since this body cam footage is out there, what's happened to them?
Nothing. Absolutely nothing. The police just insist when they even bother to say anything, which, as I said, the sheriff hasn't replied to any of my 10 letters. They do nothing. There is a man who was not there, as far as I know, named Patricio Rojas, and he told me that he's not gonna allow me to even submit a crime report. He said that there was an investigation, but of course there was not. No one talked to me as part of any investigation, so obviously there was no investigation. It's just a lie. So there's deep corruption in the sheriff's office. They were simply waiting for my mother to die, and which she did do. But they'll have to kill me to get me to stop. Because now Chris Farley might, because when you and I both know, when you send white cops to someone's house, anything could happen.
Correct.
If I had gotten slightly angrier than I was, maybe I would have been hauled out on a gurney. And that may have been that obviously was something Christopher Farley was comfortable with, or maybe even had hoped for.
So what's the relationship with you and your 3 brothers now?
Christopher Farley has not spoken to me directly or indirectly since even a week before that violent kidnapping.
Okay.
Not even when they kidnapped my mother the first time and I was talking to him, he didn't even reply to me. Anthony Farley, I only saw him just by accident. Or not by accident. I spoke to him by accident once because my mother, after we had freed my mother from their grasp, she was in a hospital, and Anthony came into the room, and I said hi to him, thinking it was a hospital worker. But that's as much as I've spoken to him since February 5, the day of the violent kidnapping in 2023. Felipe Farley, I am more tolerant of, but as I said, he dated Mary Ho. He should be viewed as a co-conspirator, even though he wasn't.
Where is she now?
We do not know.
Okay.
I had my lawyer tried to subpoena her, and he was not able to find her. So I do not know where Mary Ho is. But obviously she's a chief culprit. I do have evidence now, if you want to talk about the money. 10 days before my mother died, her bank account was either emptied or almost emptied. And on April 6th of this year, she had $197,000. So that means $190,000 was taken from her account in a 4-month time period. My brother Felipe says he did not have access to my mother's bank account. Chris Farley did have access to my mother's bank account. This should be investigated, but it has not been. And even the $197,000 is too little for what my mother got, even in retirement. One person who's familiar with the pensions earned by State University of New York professors, which my parents both were, told me that she knew what my mother made, what my father made, and this woman told me that my mother should have $1 million. Well, now I know she has less than $6,100, and she might have $0. So where is that money? Right? That's what an investigation should come up, and I have hired someone to try to dig up that information. The judge in the case that started a week after the violent kidnapping has denied me access to that information and even fined me $13,000 because my attorneys tried to get that information and because my attorneys tried to have my brother Chris removed as temporary guardian too many times.
Right.
This also is must be a complete violation of his abuse of his power, the judge's power, and Judge Christopher Chacha should be removed from the bench for this because I'm entitled to this information. But that would uncover, I think, a motivation for the heinous crime committed by Chris Farley. I also uncovered that 5 days before the first kidnapping, a transfer of $145,900 to my mother's, I believe, her savings account. I doubt my mother did that. And Christopher Farley said in one of his court documents that we forced him to submit that the house was worth $145,900. So unless it's a gigantic coincidence.
Right. But I highly doubt that.
Yeah,
this is 1 point. You're a mathematician, so it's like a 0.1% chance that.
Yeah. So this is what I've been saying all along. I got this information, unfortunately, after my mother died. But we have it now. This is what should be researched. So the question is someone allowed to just be kidnapped? And now that she is, and while any of us could die tomorrow,
right?
It's clear her life was not prolonged by being dragged out of her house, drugged for a year. We don't know how many times she was beaten. I have notes, photographed notes that my mother wrote about how she was shoved to the ground. We have notes from the facility itself about altercations where my mother was demanding that they free her. And at one point, she's a week after they kidnapped her violently, the facility itself says she was pushed to the ground, or they don't say she was pushed, but they say she wound up on the ground, falling backwards. But obviously, she was shoved by their employee. We don't know how much of this happened because Chris Farley criminally deprived people of the ability to see her. with almost no exceptions. So this is the so we can't say how much she was tortured, abused, but eventually I'll get all that information. Eventually, Chris Farley, I'm confident Chris Farley will be in prison. Anthony Farley, I hope to put in prison as well. Felipe Farley may or may not go to prison, but he deserves to go to prison as well, because when he was guardian, he could have just freed my mother, essentially. He could have just sent her back to her house. He could have stopped having her be put on these drugs. He claims that he did, but he didn't. Or at least the way he said it, he just told them she was allergic to the drugs, but she wasn't allergic to the drugs. She shouldn't have been given the drugs. These weren't drugs she ever needed before she was kidnapped, and she probably didn't need them while she was a prisoner. It's all going to come out, but where your audience can help is to spread the word, spread the word of the video. And if anyone has any connections with a lawyer who wants to make, like, if he wants to say, it's too late to save my mother's life, but to get justice for her, or, okay, I know lawyers aren't altruistic. If that lawyer wants $100 million, he can contact me, or you can, your audience can have any lawyer friend of theirs contact me, because this was a criminal case. It should never have been a civil case, but when I sue them, the police, the facility that held my mother called Cranberry Landing, they're all going to lose.
Okay. Where can they contact you at?
So they can reach me via my personal website, latticetheory.net. That's LATTICETHEORY.net. But also, you can find me, Jonathan Farley, if you Google my name. I'm a mathematician, and there might be many ways that you could see of contacting me. But latticetheory.net is certainly a way to do so. But I encourage people to go to the YouTube channel, Free Ena Farley, and watch other videos that clarify what is going on. And you'll see that it was just a crime. We live in a country where you can just commit violent crimes against people. Her memory is not the issue, and get away with it, because that could have happened to a 35-year-old woman, with perfect memory. All they did was physically overpower my mother. That's all. Tie her up and then prevent her from making phone calls. She was not allowed to call anyone. She was not allowed to get a lawyer. She was not allowed, as I said already, to have visitors of her own choosing. Her rights were just taken. She was treated as if she had already been declared mentally incompetent. And in the videos, you hear the policeman say this lie that, oh, courts have decided you can't make decisions. No court had decided that. That was just a lie, probably told to them by Chris Farley, the liar.
Well, we'll do everything, because we passed the time. We'll do everything we can do to support you. So that is LatencyTheory.net. You can check it out on the YouTube channel. What was it?
It's Free Ena Farley. The YouTube channel is Free Ena Farley.
Free Ena Farley. And just before we go, there's a picture of her before everything when she was hooded. Looks like she was hooded that day.
Well, yeah, she was a member of the Board of Regents of New York State.
Okay. So that's what we can do here for you at Amsterdam Talk. Make sure we keep the good fight going for you. We'll say her name, Ena Farley. You can check the story out on YouTube. You can go to LatencyTheory.net. Or you can contact, her son right here, Jonathan Farley, directly, and just show your support, because it sounds like this crime should not go unpunished. Doesn't need to go unpunished.
Yeah.
So thank you again for coming and sharing your story with us. We pray for you. We'll say your mother's name, say Ena Farley. Guys, we'll see you next week. Same time, same channel.
Thank you.